Welcome back to another episode of Morning Coffee. I'm your host, Rick Alexander. You guys can interact with me or follow me at @RickAlexander_ or at the Morning Coffee Podcast on Instagram. Now, if you're getting a lot from this show, if it's changing your life or even changing the way that you look at your life, it would mean the world to me if you would head to iTunes and give us a 5-star review so that we can continue to climb the charts and get this information to more and more people. Over the last year and a half, I've focused my work on the story that we tell ourselves about our lives. Your entire life is a bit of a story that you're telling yourself. And if you could tell yourself a different story, you could probably change your life quite a bit. And so I did that work for the release of my newest book, which is coming out in early 2020. But getting excited for that release, I actually wanted to go through a lot of the information that I had learned, a lot of my notes, and synthesize it into maxims, which is what we're getting into today. I've got 21 maxims to maximize your life, and what these are is just things that seem to be true about the human experience, and if you could understand how they are true, you could understand how they could change your life. And so if you go to rickalexander.com, what you're going to find is if you click on articles, the maxim of the day is going to be posted, whatever the last maxim was, and it's also going to have journal entries and thought experiments in there so that you can figure out how to apply these things to your own lives. And so a bit of an interactive experience. So throughout the next year, through my speaking, through my book release, and through these maxims, I'm excited to see how this information can really change the world and change your world if you give it an opportunity to. One of my favorite quotes of all time was Ernest Hemingway when he said, "Never delay kissing a pretty girl or opening a bottle of whiskey." And I'm not going to lie to you, I try to live my life that way, because if you don't, you'll wish you did. You know, there was a moment in the first Transformers movie, and maybe nobody actually even remembers this, but in it, there's a moment where they're starting to realize that Transformers are trying to take over their world. And they're sort of in the beginning of the movie where they're getting ready for their call to adventure, their call to participate in the things that are going on around them. And in that moment, the Even Stevens kid is talking to Megan Fox, and he's trying to enlist her in this call to adventure in some way, in this opportunity to participate, and in it she's reluctant, like we all are when we have an opportunity to participate in something much bigger than ourselves. And he says something to her. He says, "In 60 years from now, you're going to wish you got in the car." And I think that's something to really meditate on, because 60 years from now, you're always going to wish that you got in the car. One of the things that continuously comes up in end-of-life research and talking to people who are sort of nearing the end of their experience here on Earth is this moment where they cue in on all the moments where they could have done something and they chose not to. I think those are the moments that they end up regretting in some way or wishing that they could relive. And you could say, well, does it matter in the end anyway? Maybe not, right? But it matters right now. And that's why I would say it matters. If you don't, you'll wish you did. You know, it's kind of like we talked yesterday, that perspective is not that important to you because it matters right now. And so if it matters right now, you have to make decisions that will improve the quality of your life right now. And so if you have an opportunity to live bigger, if you're being invited by the world in some way to do something differently, then if you don't take it, my experience is you'll always look back and wish that you did. And I think in some way this has been a gift in my own life, because I almost always take up experience and I almost always say yes to things I really want to do. And as a result, I really don't have any moments where I look back and wish I could redo stuff. I'm like, no, I feel like I took the opportunities that were presented when I was there. And how could I ever, sometimes things work out, sometimes they don't, but how could I ever regret that? As long as you take the step, then you can't regret that. You don't get to control the outcome, right? But you do get to control the invitation. You do get to control the acceptance of what you want. Regardless how you conceptualize the meaning of life, you can find great meaning in life if you prioritize astounding, meaningful experiences. And this means that you have to say yes to things in your life that might intrigue you. It also means that you don't get to use what keeps you comfortable as a way of deciding what you should and shouldn't do. And that's what happens a lot. Like a lot of times we decide we have certain things in our lives. Like that's what golden handcuffs are, right? It's like you have this amount of money, you have this amount of success, you have this amount of esteem, you have this amount of stature in your life. And those are the things that keep you comfortable, right? But if you want to step into ultimate experience in this life and ultimate meaning, it might mean that you have to step away from those things, right? Sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. But most of the time, this life isn't about what you've already achieved. And here's the other thing. If you continue to talk about what you've already achieved and you're no longer trying to achieve new things, right? Like this is the stereotypical high school quarterback that always talks about high school, even though those times are past. What you become is this weird caricature of yourself. And so instead of the person that's doing, you become the person that has been. And again, you become this weird caricature of yourself where you're talking about all these things that you used to do. And it's not a good look on the human condition. I think that this life it's for the living, and we all have this deep desire, like this deep feeling, right? Like we want to live while we're alive. And it's like, why is that? I think it's because part of the purpose of living is experience in and of itself. And so you have an opportunity to step into more and more experience, but you also have the opportunity to allow what's kept you comfortable or what keeps you comfortable now from deciding that you're not going to step into those things. Again, I think 60 years from now, you're going to wish that you got in the car. But again, that means you have to make the decision to put physical fears in their actual right place, which is below the desire for experience. And so throughout these maxims, we've talked a little bit about existential fears, right? Like the fear of failure and the fear of things not working out and the fear of what things might mean about you. Well, as we talk about stepping into real world experience, now you're starting to talk about physical fears, right? Now, a lot of times we put physical fears in a position in our hierarchy system, like in our value hierarchies, that put them above our desire for experience. And so basically we have a desire for experience, but because we've decided that we're more scared of something, like let's say we have a desire to skydive, but we're more scared of heights, we allow that fear to dictate how our life turns out, right? But the reality is that you want to make the decisions that put the fear in their actual right place, which is below your desire for experience. Tactically, that means that you have to actually learn the skills that will help eke you out of your comfort zone, right? You might not be used to talking publicly or booking the ticket or committing to the adventure in some way. But all this actually means is that you aren't used to it, right? It doesn't mean anything else. Something I've said before on here is that clinically speaking, the way that we get people to grapple with their fears and to overcome them is actually through gradual exposure. And through gradual exposure, what you become is more brave, not less scared. But as you become more brave, that's a characteristic that you get to take anywhere with you. And so again, tactically, what you're looking to do is figure out ways that help eke you out of your comfort zone, right? Because if you've lived in a way that have allowed all these physical fears to box you into a smaller existence, you have an uphill battle because you've got to learn to overcome these patterns and overcome the way that you've actually been in your life. But in order to get out of your comfort zone, you have to decide that you want to. Or rather, you have to just tell yourself a different story about your own capabilities a lot of times, right? Like a lot of times we're just telling ourselves like we couldn't do that. And then I would point you back to the older maxim, which is like, okay, so that's true, but what else is true? You definitely can be a failure, but what else? Could you be a success? What else might transpire? Adventure is it's one of my ultimate values in life. It's a top 3 for me. And the reason it's a top value for me is because I know that once I push off the curb, once I step off into adventure, between where I am and where I'm going to be, I'm going to learn something new about myself. I'm going to learn something new that's going to help me become someone else and get me closer to where I ultimately want to be. And so I value that adventure. And so anytime I come up to physical fears, I have to put that in its right place, which is below my desire for experience. And so that's why I was able to have a fully high-functioning career in the military as special forces with a ridiculous fear of heights, like truly a fear of heights. But I was able to overcome it through eking myself out of my comfort zone. What that looked like is breathing tactics to help control my physiology and some mental tricks and stuff like that. But these things are all available to us, right? It's not, whatever it is that's coming up for you, it's not a good enough reason not to do the thing in the first place. And right? And just as a thought experiment, one of my favorite things is to just ask people who you would be if all of the what ifs were taken care of in your life. Like we go through life with loose ends everywhere, right? Because we have all these ideas about what we could be and who we could be and what we could do. And if we never act on them, and we never actually give them an opportunity to materialize, then what they become is just another thing that vies for our bandwidth, another thing that keeps us from becoming who we can become. Sometimes you do things and you realize that you don't want to do it, right? You realize that it's not what you thought it was. In fact, a lot of times that happens a lot of times, and that's actually just as valuable. That was one of the cases I made in my first book, is that If you engage with the world in some way and you find experiences that you don't want to be living, that's actually just as important. So if you decide to start the business and then you realize that the business you didn't want to start, it's actually just as important, because it's not rattling around in your head as a loose end anymore. Now there's more of you that you can reclaim and put toward what you do want. And you have to be careful that all of your ideas about what could be don't get in the way of what is. You got to actually start engaging with reality and figure out if what could be actually will be. Otherwise, it'll stay what could be. And 60 years from now, it'll just be regret. Okay, and it keeps us small too, in a way, because it's so hard to push forward and push on in the future into what we want when we're stuck with regrets, or we're stuck with these other ideas of what we could be. Don't allow those to become regrets. And then I think that the real beauty in this is that as you step into experience, some of them are going to be extremely meaningful and extremely astounding. And in those experiences, you will know that the mystery of life reveals itself in the depth of experience and not in the depth of thought, which is why it's so important that you engage with reality in the way that you want to, because that's where you're going to learn these things. Like, we can sit around and we could talk about what's the meaning of life and what's the point of all this, but it's in experience that you feel it and that you don't need to talk about it. So I would just push you to continue to step into those experiences. It's changed my life in a pretty drastic way. So I love you guys. Hope you have an amazing day. We'll chat later on Morning Coffee.